7. Japan's first bubble economy.
日本的第一个泡沫经济，
Triumph of the war economy.
战争经济的胜利。
The peacetime war economy was highly successful. In the 1950s and 1960s, Japan grew virtually continuously at double-digit growth rates. In 1959, the economy expanded 17% in real terms, while inflation remained modest. In 1960, leading economists made the stunning case that Japan could double its national income within the coming decade. XMOF War Economy Control bureaucrat and economist Osamu Shimomura argued that Japan could probably even raise its GDP 2.5 if not 3 times in this period. 1 In the event, from 1960 to 1970, Japan's real GDP rose from 71.6 trillion yen to 188.3 trillion yen, up 2.6 times. By 1970, Japan had overtaken Germany and soared from the ashes to become the number 2 economic power in the world.
和平时期的战争经济取得了巨大的成功。在1950年代和1960年代，日本几乎持续以2位数的增长率增长。1959年，经济实际增长了 17%， 而通胀保持适度。1960年，一些领先的经济学家令人震惊地提出，日本可能在未来10年内将其国民收入翻倍。前财政省战争经济控制官僚和经济学家下村治认为，日本可能甚至在这个时期将其 GDP 提高2倍半，如果不是3倍。事实上，从1960年到1970年，日本的实际 GDP 从 71.6 万亿日元增长到 188.3 万亿日元，增长了 2.6 倍。到1970年，日本已经超过了德国，从废墟中崛起，成为世界第2大经济强国。
It had not yet become public or media perception, but the increasing trade surpluses of the 1970s made it appear to U.S. trade negotiators as if Japan had triumphed over the United States after all. Not during the war, perhaps, but after the war with its fully mobilized economy that was directed by the guidance of government officials. However, its very success reduced the world's, and especially the United States' tolerance for Japan's economic system. The first major trade dispute erupted in the 1960s concerning textiles. The first round of trade liberalizations had taken place in 1961, but the U.S. side was dissatisfied and demanded abolition of Japanese import restrictions in order to reduce the trade imbalance. Bilateral trade negotiations were bogged down by discussions about individual tariffs and quotas. Meanwhile, U.S. trade deficits with Japan grew from $400 million in 1967 to $1.2 billion in 1968 and $1.6 billion in 1969. The United States attempted to limit Japanese exports of synthetic textiles and wool. But the textile dispute was stuck in quagmire negotiations from 1969 to 1970. The Japanese side argued that the U.S. proposal to limit Japanese textile exports violated the principle of free trade. 2 That was true. However, Japan failed to point out that its entire economic system had been created as a bulwark against manufactured imports and was geared toward maximum exports. Likewise, the U.S. failed to point out that, like any aspiring emerging economy, it had achieved its own economic success also thanks to protectionism and government intervention. Free market economics provided the arguments for the dominant power to gain access to other markets.
虽然这还没有成为公众或媒体的认知，但1970年代日益增加的贸易顺差使美国的贸易谈判者感觉，日本似乎在战后以其全面动员的经济体制，由政府官员的指导下，最终还是战胜了美国。然而，它的成功却降低了世界，尤其是美国对日本经济体制的容忍度。第一次重大的贸易争端在1960年代爆发，涉及纺织品。第一轮的贸易自由化在1961年进行，但美方不满意，要求日本取消进口限制，以减少贸易不平衡。双边贸易谈判被关于个别关税和配额的讨论所困扰。与此同时，美国对日本的贸易逆差从1967年的4亿美元增长到1968年的12亿美元，1969年增长到16亿美元。美国试图限制日本的合成纺织品和羊毛的出口，但是纺织品争端在1969年到1970年陷入了泥潭式的谈判。日本方面辩称，美国提出的限制日本纺织品出口的提议违反了自由贸易的原则，这是真的。然而， 日本没有指出其整个经济体系是作为对抗制造业进口的堡垒而创建的，而且是以最大化出口为目标。同样，美国也没有指出，像任何有抱负的新兴经济体一样，它也是通过保护主义和政府干预实现自己的经济成功的。自由市场经济为主导大国进入其他市场提供了论据。
In the 1970s, the Japanese automobile and consumer electronics industries were on the ascendancy. In 1970, the U.S. television maker Zenith filed a suit charging that Japan was dumping television sets in the United States. This was hard to prove. Indeed, the true cause of Japanese companies' incredible competitiveness was not explicit dumping by individual companies. It was systemic. Japan's economy was designed to dump its products onto the world markets, a whole nation engaging in social dumping. In 1971, OECD countries had an overall trade surplus of $7.4 billion. Of these, $5.8 billion was accounted for by Japan.
在1970年代，日本的汽车和消费电子产业正在崛起。1970年，美国电视制造商 Zenith 提起诉讼，指控日本在美国倾销电视机。这很难证明。事实上，日本公司令人难以置信的竞争力的真正原因，并不是个别公司的明显倾销，这是系统性的。日本的经济被设计成向世界市场倾销其产品，整个国家都在进行社会倾销。1971年，经合组织国家的总贸易顺差为74亿美元，其中58亿美元是由日本贡献的。
As in other industries, American and European market leaders did not know what had struck them. Sure that their products were superior to Japanese cheap mass production, they failed to recognize the single-minded determination of Japan's corporations to gain market share, a policy that took no prisoners. It was aimed at annihilating overseas competitors.
就像在其他行业一样，美国和欧洲的市场领导者不知道他们遭受了什么打击。他们确信他们的产品优于日本的廉价大规模生产，他们没有认识到日本公司为获得市场份额的坚定决心，这是一种不留余地的政策。它旨在消灭海外竞争者。
The United States had consented to the maintenance of the mobilized war economy in Japan because of the Cold War and the expansion of communism in Asia. The price had been high. The war economy, with its relentless orientation toward market share expansion and disdain for profitability, could not fail to drive many American and European companies out of business. First in textiles, then in steel and shipping, one industrial sector after another was being usurped by the Japanese economic machine. The once proud U.S. consumer electronics firm Zenith stopped producing radios in 1982. It is today owned by Korea's LG Electronics Group.
由于冷战和亚洲共产主义的扩张，美国同意维持日本的动员战争经济，代价是巨大的。战争经济以其对市场份额扩张的无情追求和对盈利的蔑视，无疑会把许多美国和欧洲公司逼出市场。首先是纺织业，然后是钢铁和航运业，一个又一个的工业部门被日本的经济机器所篡夺。曾经引以为傲的美国消费电子公司 Zenith 在1982年停止了收音机的生产，如今它被韩国的 LG 电子集团所拥有。
Revaluation.
再估值。
Remedies were being discussed. The Ministry of Finance quietly began looking into a revaluation of the yen. But a group of internationally minded officials and intellectuals in Japan realized that the war economy system itself would have to be changed for America to get its way. Eventually, Japan would have to introduce freer markets and open itself up to imports, thus allowing foreign companies to sell their products in Japan. But these reformers were in a minority. A system that had been created during the war and which had become increasingly entrenched in the decades of post-war success was not dismantled easily. Vested interests had been created in the bureaucracy that thrived on the power provided by the licensing system, businesses that earned monopoly profits and closed domestic markets, and politicians that received support from the vested interests. Most of all, ordinary Japanese benefited from the wealth the system had created for them and distributed relatively equally. How could a general consensus be established that Japan needed to change?
人们正在讨论对策。财政部悄悄开始研究对日元的再估值。但是，日本的一些具有国际视野的官员和知识分子意识到，为了让美国达到目的，战争经济体系本身必须改变。最终， 日本将不得不引入更自由的市场，开放进口，从而允许外国公司在日本销售他们的产品。但是，这些改革者是少数。一个在战争期间创建的系统，在战后几十年的成功中变得越来越根深蒂固，不是那么容易就能拆除的。在许可制度提供的权利下，官僚机构中产生了既得利益，这些企业在封闭的国内市场中获得了垄断利润，政治家们得到了既得利益的支持。最重要的是，普通日本人从这个系统为他们创造并相对均等分配的财富中受益。如何建立日本需要改变的普遍共识呢？
The first doubts among the broader public about Japan's economic structure were sown in the mid-1970s. In many ways, this episode represented a test run of the much bigger and more far-reaching events of the 1980s and 1990s. It certainly provided an important learning and testing ground for key Bank of Japan officials.
对日本经济结构的首次质疑出现在1970年代中期的广大公众中。在许多方面，这一事件代表了1980年代和1990年代更大更深远事件的试运行。这无疑为日本银行的关键官员提供了重要的学习和测试场地。
Busting the dollar standard.
打破美元标准。
From the early post-war years and until 1971, the major world currencies were pegged to the US dollar. For Japan, the exchange rate was yen 360/dollar, the figure said to have been chosen by U.S. banker Joseph Dodge after he learned that the name for the Japanese currency, yen, also meant round or circular. 0.3 The US dollar was in turn fixed to the gold price, and the U.S. Federal Reserve was officially obliged to convert dollars into gold on demand to foreign treasuries or central banks.
从战后初期到1971年，主要的世界货币都与美元挂钩。对日本来说，汇率是每美元360日元。据说这个数字是由美国银行家约瑟夫·道奇选择的。他了解到日本货币的名字日元也意味着圆或圆形。美元反过来又固定在黄金价格上。美国联邦储备系统官方有义务按需将美元兑换成黄金给外国财政部或中央银行。
As we saw in Chapter 3, the dollar peg was convenient for the United States because it enabled it to print more dollars that the world had to accept. In the 1960s, the Federal Reserve encouraged U.S. banks to step up credit creation. More and more dollars were created, and they spilled over as foreign investment. With these dollars, U.S. companies undertook large-scale purchases of European corporations, le défi américain. 4.
正如我们在第3章中看到的，美元挂钩对美国来说是方便的，因为它使美国能够印制更多世界必须接受的美元。在1960年代，美联储鼓励美国银行加大信贷创造，越来越多的美元被创造出来，并作为外国投资溢出。有了这些美元，美国公司进行了大规模的欧洲公司购买，美国的挑战。
In 1971, when the French realized that the Americans printed money and bought up Europe, they called the United States bluff. They took all those dollars that had been flooding into France and brought them to the United States, demanding that they be converted into gold. This was the famed French raid on Fort Knox. Of course, there were not enough gold reserves. Consequently, in August 1971, in what is often called the Nixon shock, the United States had to suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold. The fixed exchange rate system collapsed, and the U.S. dollar fell sharply on world markets.
1971年，当法国人意识到美国人印钞买通欧洲时，他们揭穿了美国的虚张声势。他们拿走了涌入法国的所有美元，并带到美国，要求将其兑换成黄金。这就是著名的法国对美国金库的突袭。当然，黄金储备是不够的。因此，1971年8月，在被称为尼克松冲击的事件中，美国不得不暂停美元兑换黄金。固定汇率体系崩溃，美元在世界市场上大幅下跌。
Japan was taken by surprise. The BOJ and MOF waited another 10 days before abandoning the pegged exchange rate. During this time, the BOJ worked hard to keep the yen weak. To do so, it printed money aggressively, then went out and sold these yen to buy U.S. dollars in the foreign exchange markets. Its foreign exchange reserves jumped by US $5 billion in the space of the single month of August. Then, the yen rose, triggering the short-lived Smithsonian Agreement, which fixed it at yen 308/dollar in December 1971.
日本被这一突变吓了一跳。日本银行和财政省又等了10天才放弃固定汇率。在此期间，日本银行努力保持日元疲软，为此，他大量印制货币，然后在外汇市场上出售这些日元以购买美元。其外汇储备在短短1个月的8月份增加了50亿美元。然后，日元升值，引发了短暂的史密森尼协议。该协议在1971年12月将其固定在每美元308日元。
The BOJ continued to attempt to weaken the yen by creating purchasing power. It did this by buying up domestic assets, such as bonds, and paying with newly created cash. Moreover, it felt that it needed to stimulate domestic demand sharply, because the sudden strengthening of the yen was going to hurt exports. So it also used its window guidance control mechanism to make banks create significantly more credit. What were at the time record amounts of liquidity were pumped into the economy.
日本银行继续试图通过创造购买力来削弱日元。它通过购买国内资产，如债券，并用新创造的现金支付来实现这一目标。此外，由于日元的突然升值可能会损害出口，他觉得需要大幅刺激国内需求。因此，他还利用其窗口指导控制机制，使银行创造出更多的信贷。当时创纪录的流动性被注入经济。
In the end, the negative shock to exporters ended up being smaller than feared, because the yen had been greatly undervalued during the dollar peg system. Moreover, Japan's economic structure essentially remained closed to manufacturing imports. Most imports consisted of raw materials that were needed for processing and eventual re-exporting. The strong yen made the raw material imports cheaper. All in all, the new exchange rate was not an insurmountable problem for exporters.
最后，对出口商的负面冲击比预期的要小，因为在美元挂钩制度期间，日元被大大低估了。此外，日本的经济结构基本上对制造业进口保持关闭，大部分进口都是用于加工和最终再出口的原材料。强劲的日元使原材料进口变得更便宜。总的来说，新的汇率对出口商来说并非无法克服的问题。
The first bubble economy.
第一个泡沫经济。
So it turned out that the monetary stimulus by the Bank of Japan was greatly overdone. Banks, struggling to meet the high window guidance loan quotas ordered by the banking department of the BOJ, virtually begged firms to borrow money from them. Already flush in liquidity and fully invested in productive projects, the firms used the bank loans to fund unproductive activities. They embarked on speculative land purchases. This happened at a time when Prime Minister Kakui Tanaka's plan for rebuilding the archipelago and the industrial relocation promotion law he had pushed through while still MIDI minister encouraged construction. Given the policy incentives and the seemingly limitless liquidity from the banks, many companies joined the land rush. As the value of land as collateral rose, banks became even more eager to fund the growing land speculation. Land prices exploded in 1972 and 1973. Capital gains on land holdings produced substantial paper profits. That made the firm's stocks attractive. With excess credit creation spilling over into the stock market, a hitherto unprecedented stock boom occurred. The Nikkei 225 stock index rose from 3,000 yen in March 1972 to 5,000 yen by the end of 1972. Capital gains by firms were enormous. In 1972, land capital gains amounted to 15 trillion yen and stock gains to 5 trillion yen.
原来，日本银行的货币刺激措施过度了。银行在努力满足日本银行银行业务部门下达的高额窗口指导贷款配额的同时，几乎祈求企业从他们那里借款。这些企业已经拥有充足的流动性，并且已经全面投资于生产性项目。他们使用银行贷款来资助非生产性活动。他们开始投机购买土地。这发生在田中角荣首相的重建群岛计划和他在任经济产业大臣期间推动的工业搬迁促进法鼓励建设的时候。鉴于政策激励和银行看似无尽的流动性，许多公司加入了抢购土地的行列。随着土地作为抵押品的价值上升，银行变得更加渴望资助日益增长的土地投机。1972年和1973年，土地价格暴涨。土地持有的资本收益产生了大量的账面利润，这使得公司的股票变得有吸引力。随着过度的信贷创造溢出到股市，出现了前所未有的股市繁荣。 日经225股票指数从1972年3月的3000日元上升到1972年底的5000日元。公司的资本收益巨大，1972年土地资本收益达到15万亿日元，股票收益达到5万亿日元。
The Bojay-induced credit boom was so large that it began to spill over from asset markets into the real economy. As investment and consumption demand picked up, consumer prices and wholesale prices started to soar. A lot of money was chasing a limited amount of assets and goods. The excess money was heating up most markets. The craze for speculation spread to golf club memberships, art and antiques, jewelry, and rare coins. 5.
日本银行引发的信贷繁荣如此巨大，以至于开始从资产市场溢出到实体经济。随着投资和消费需求的增加，消费者价格和批发价格开始飙升。大量的钱在追逐有限的资产和商品，过剩的钱正在加热大多数市场。投机狂热蔓延到高尔夫俱乐部会员资格、艺术品和古董、珠宝和稀有硬币。
All this happened before the oil shock of November 1973. The sudden jump in oil prices did not assuage the situation, although it was mitigated by the strong yen. Triggered by the oil shock, a stampede on certain consumer staples followed. This sometimes reached hysterical proportions, such as with the legendary Osaka toilet paper run. In 1974, the consumer price index rose 26% year-on-year, YOY, and the wholesale price index 37%. The crazy prices began to create social friction between those who owned land or had access to bank finance and those who did not.
所有这些都发生在1973年11月的石油冲击之前。石油价格的突然上涨并没有缓解这种情况，尽管强劲的日元有所缓解。由石油冲击引发的对某些消费品的疯狂抢购接踵而至，这有时达到了歇斯底里的程度，比如传说中的大阪卫生纸抢购。1974年，消费者价格指数同比上涨 26%， 批发价格指数上涨 37%。疯狂的价格开始在拥有土地或有银行融资渠道的人和没有的人之间产生社会摩擦。
It is often thought that the pre-oil shock asset inflation was the result of Prime Minister Tanaka's stimulatory fiscal policy. However, as we have seen, fiscal policy can affect the economy only if it is monetized. Thus, the monetization, in other words, the Bojay's credit policy, remains the key variable. The best test of this argument is a comparison of the early 1970s and the late 1990s. In both periods, there was significant fiscal stimulation. Indeed, the fiscal stimulation of the mid to late 1990s was far larger than the fiscal stimulation of the early 1970s. There is even the similarity of sharply rising oil prices, as between December 1998 and January 2000 oil prices almost tripled. Although Japan's dependence on oil has fallen, it is clear that this supply shock puts upward pressure on prices. Traditional theory makes us expect an inflationary boom in the late 1990s in Japan. However, during this time, the largest deflation since the 1930s was recorded. This shows that we have missed a key variable. What is the main difference between these two time periods? It is neither fiscal policy nor oil prices, but the quantitative credit policy of the Bank of Japan.
人们常常认为，石油冲击前的资产通胀是田中角荣首相刺激性财政政策的结果。然而，正如我们所看到的，财政政策只有在货币化的情况下才能影响经济。因此，货币化，换句话说，日本银行的信贷政策仍然是关键变量。对这个论点的最好测试是比较1970年代初和1990年代末的情况，在这两个时期都有显著的财政刺激。实际上，1990年代中后期的财政刺激远大于1970年代初的财政刺激，甚至在石油价格急剧上涨的情况下也有相似之处。比如，在1998年12月和2000年1月之间，石油价格几乎翻了3倍。尽管日本对石油的依赖度已经下降，但很明显，这种供应冲击对价格产生了上行压力。传统理论使我们预期在1990年代末的日本会出现通胀繁荣。然而，在这段时间记录了自1930年代以来最大的通缩，这表明我们错过了一个关键变量。这两个时期的主要区别是什么？既不是财政政策，也不是石油价格， 而是日本银行的数量信贷政策。
The first big bust.
第一次大崩溃。
By 1973, it had become clear that excess credit creation was being used merely for speculative land and asset transactions, thus pushing up asset prices. Urban land prices jumped by more than 50% from 1972 to 1974. Since these loans had been used speculatively, it was also clear that in aggregate, banks could not expect them to be paid back. Only credit creation that is used for productive purposes can be paid back from the income streams the projects generate. Credit creation used for speculation must eventually turn into bad debts. That will hurt banks, which then reduce lending. As a result, economic activity falls and the economy moves into recession, a classic case of a bank-based boom/bust cycle.
到1973年，过度的信贷创造仅用于投机性的土地和资产交易，从而推高了资产价格。从1972年到1974年，城市土地价格跃升了50%以上。由于这些贷款被用于投机，很明显，总体上银行不能期望他们能够偿还，只有用于生产性目的的信贷创造才能从项目产生的收入流中偿还。用于投机的信贷创造最终必须变成坏账，这将伤害银行，然后减少贷款。结果，经济活动下降，经济进入衰退，这是一个典型的基于银行的繁荣衰退周期。
Again, it was the Bank of Japan that acted as the catalyst for a turn in the business cycle through its key policy tool, window guidance. From the first quarter of 1973, it imposed tight window guidance loan growth ceilings. First, it reduced loan growth to the modest growth rate of 12.7% YOY. In the second quarter, it imposed a reduction of the loan increase quota compared to the same period a year earlier, by 16%. The tightening continued, with the window guidance loan increase quotas in the third quarter down by 24% YOY and the fourth quarter down by 41% YOY, followed by a stunning drop of 65.4% YOY in the first quarter of 1974.6.
在此，日本银行通过其关键政策工具窗口指导，起到了商业周期转折的催化剂作用。从1973年第一季度开始，它实施了严格的窗口指导贷款增长上限。首先，它将贷款增长降低到了较为适中的年增长率 12.7%。在第二季度，它对比去年同期的贷款增长额度进行了削减，降低了 16%。紧缩政策持续进行，第三季度的窗口指导贷款增长额度年增长率下降了 24%， 第四季度下降了 41%。然后在1974年第一季度出现了惊人的 65.4% 的年增长率下降。6.
The tight credit controls lasted 2 full years, until early 1975. Bad debts began to pile up in the banking system. Many small firms that had exposed themselves too aggressively to real estate and housing loans in the boom years found that they were insolvent. As this became apparent, a number of shaky credit associations faced full-scale bank runs. The Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan were forced to dispatch officials to Aichi Prefecture to reassure residents that their deposits in the local credit union were secure.
严格的信贷控制持续了整整2年，直到1975年初，坏账开始在银行系统中堆积。许多在繁荣年代过于激进的投资于房地产和住房贷款的小公司发现自己无法偿债。随着这一情况的显现，一些信誉不稳的信贷协会面临全面的银行挤兑。财政部和日本银行被迫派遣官员到爱知县，以向居民保证他们在当地信用社的存款是安全的。
As the banks became paralyzed by the bad debt, they reduced lending. Small firms were hurt first, but eventually the whole economy suffered, as total credit creation slowed and economic activity therefore had to decelerate. Business profits nosedived, slumping 84% in 1975. Industrial production dropped 19% between late 1973 and early 1975. Inventory soared and capital expenditure shrank. Capacity utilization fell by 25% in 1975 compared to early 1973, leaving almost 1/4 of productive plant and equipment idle in 1975. Unemployment soared. The number of unemployed people rose to a post-war record by the end of the 1970s. Real GDP growth dropped precipitously from around 15% in the 1960s to virtually nil in 1974, and Japan sank into its biggest post-war recession. 7.
随着银行因坏账而瘫痪，他们减少了贷款。小公司首先受到影响，但最终整个经济都受到了影响，因为总信贷创造放缓，经济活动因此不得不减速。企业利润暴跌，在1975年下降了 84%。从1973年底到1975年初，工业生产下降了 19%， 库存激增，资本支出缩减。1975年的产能利用率比1973年初下降了 25%， 使得1975年几乎有1/4的生产设备和设备闲置。失业率飙升，到1970年代末，失业人数达到了战后的最高纪录。实际 GDP 增长从1960年代的约 15%急剧下降到1974年的几乎为0，日本陷入了战后最大的经济衰退。7.
After high inflation, deflation became a problem. Prices started to fall in 1975. The Bank of Japan watched as its roller coaster window guidance policy created the most severe post-war recession. The slump indeed marked the end of Japan's so-called high-growth period. Japan had enjoyed 2 decades of double-digit growth, the fastest-growing large economy in the world. But by 1974, growth had come to a screeching halt.
在高通胀之后，通货紧缩成为了一个问题，价格在1975年开始下跌。日本银行看着其过山车式的窗口指导政策，造成了战后最严重的经济衰退。这次衰退确实标志着日本所谓的高增长期的结束。日本曾享受了20年的2位数增长，世界上增长最快的大型经济体。但到1974年，增长已经停滞不前。
Minos debut.
三重野出道。
The recession lasted longer and was more severe than had been anticipated. Despite a string of fiscal stimulus packages, such as in February, March, and June 1975, and a repeated reduction in interest rates, the economy did not respond. Increased public works spending and infusion of credit by the Public Housing Loan Corporation in 1976 merely raised the fiscal deficit. With rising unemployment benefits, by early 1976, not only the private sector but also the public sector looked shaky.
这次衰退持续的时间比预期的要长，严重程度也比预期的要大。尽管有一系列的财政刺激计划，如1975年2月、3月和6月的计划，以及反复降低利率，但经济并未有所反应。1976年，公共住房贷款公司的信贷注入和公共工程支出的增加，只是提高了财政赤字。随着失业救济金的增加，到1976年初，不仅私营部门，公共部门也显得岌岌可危。
In late 1976, industrial production finally recovered and reached its previous peak levels of October 1973 again. Japan's worst post-war slump was ending. The reason? The necessary and sufficient condition for economic recovery had been an increase in credit growth. In late 1975 and early 1976, the Bank of Japan had raised its window guidance loan growth ceilings. Who was at the controls of the economy? The vice governor of the Bank of Japan was somebody called Haruo Maekawa. From April 1975 to February 1978, the head of the banking department, in charge of implementing window guidance, was Yasushi Mino.
1976年底，工业生产终于恢复，并再次达到了1973年10月的前峰值。日本最严重的战后衰退正在结束，原因何在？经济复苏的必要和充分条件是信贷增长。在1975年底和1976年初，日本银行提高了其窗口指导贷款增长的上限。谁在掌控经济？日本银行的副行长是一个叫做前川春男的人。从1975年4月到1978年2月，负责实施窗口指导的银行部门的负责人是三重野径。
Crisis stimulus for rethinking.
危机对反思的刺激。
When real GDP growth, after 20 years of almost continuous double-digit growth, suddenly contracted, it did not fail to trigger a lot of soul-searching. Many observers were puzzled about the relatively long and sharp downturn and began to see the Japanese economic structure as the main culprit. Indeed, in times of serious crisis, the system, whatever its form, is likely to be blamed for the crisis and voices are likely to call for significant changes. The slump spawned many studies at think tanks, including at MIDI, which concluded that Japan would not be able to maintain the previous high economic growth rates based on its export orientation. Instead, it would have to revamp its economic structure.
当实际 GDP 增长在连续20年的几乎持续的2位数增长后突然收缩，这无疑引发了大量的反思。许多观察家对相对较长和较为严重的经济下滑感到困惑，并开始将日本的经济结构视为主要的罪魁祸首。的确，在严重危机的时期，无论系统的形势如何，都可能因为危机而受到指责，人们可能会呼吁进行重大的改变。这次衰退在智库中引发了许多研究，包括在日本经济产业省。这些研究得出的结论是，日本无法维持以出口为导向的高经济增长率。相反，它必须改革其经济结构。
Structural problems suddenly seemed a burning issue. There were a number of depressed industries in the manufacturing sector whose era seemed to have ended: shipping, petrochemicals, electric blast furnaces, soda, cardboard, and sugar refining. MIDI advised that these be transferred overseas, into other parts of Asia. It recommended that Japan become a headquarters nation, overseeing factories in many countries, such as in Asia and America. The domestic economy needed to move up the ladder to higher value-added sectors. Moreover, with the fiscal situation becoming critical, Japan's demographic problem was highlighted. Things looked bleak. A rapidly aging society with a pay-as-you-go pension system whose funds had been used up in vain attempts to stimulate the economy.
结构性问题突然成为一个紧迫的问题。制造业中有一些萎靡不振的行业，其时代似乎已经结束：航运、石化、电葫芦、苏打、纸板和糖精炼。经济产业省建议将这些行业转移到海外，如亚洲的其他地方。他建议日本成为一个总部所在的国家，监督许多国家，如亚洲和美国的工厂。国内经济需要向更高附加值的行业迈进。此外，随着财政状况变得严重，日本的人口问题被突出了。情况看起来很糟糕，一个快速老龄化的社会，一个按揭养老金制度，其资金已经在刺激经济的无效尝试中被用尽。
Calls for Japan to shift from export orientation toward expansion of domestic demand increased 0.8 to boost consumption. However, the structural impediments that had reinforced the savings bias and anti-consumption environment needed to be changed. Japan's mobilized war economy had been focused on scale maximization in strategic, mainly export, industries. However, the quality of life and standard of living of the domestic population had been neglected. Living space, housing, and medical facilities needed to be created. It was at this time that the critique of the Japanese as workaholics living in rabbit hutches was heard overseas.
呼吁日本从出口导向转向扩大国内需求的声音增加。为了提高消费，需要改变那些强化了储蓄偏好和反消费环境的结构性障碍。日本的动员战争经济一直专注于战略性的主要出口行业的规模最大化。然而，国内人口的生活质量和生活水平被忽视了，需要创建生活空间、住房和医疗设施。就在这个时候，日本人被海外批评为住在兔子笼子里的工作狂。
Recession blamed on Japan's system.
经济衰退归咎于日本的体制。
A whole list of problems with the Japanese economic system suddenly became apparent thanks to the crisis. In the early 1980s, a contemporary wrote about the shock of the 1970s as follows: "It is undeniable that the existence of inefficient and often self-righteous public corporations, the expansion of subsidies to agriculture due to overprotective policies, the inefficient national healthcare system, excessive administration intervention by the government and private enterprise, the proliferation of government-related institutions, an unclear division of responsibilities between the public and private sectors, and an unclear definition of the roles of the central government and local governments have combined to create swollen fiscal budgets and an enormous government bureaucracy." 9.
由于危机，日本经济体系的一系列问题突然显现出来。在1980年代初，一位当代人这样描述了1970年代的冲击：不可否认的是，效率低下且常常自以为是的公共公司的存在。由于过度保护政策对农业的补贴扩大，效率低下的国家医疗保健系统，政府对私营企业的过度行政干预，政府相关机构的增多，公共部门和私营部门之间职责划分不清，中央政府和地方政府角色定义不清， 这些因素共同导致了财政预算的膨胀和庞大的政府官僚机构。
In the late 1970s, leading economists and public figures felt that Japan is at an important crossroads now, and that the time has come for a basic re-examination of public choices. The so-called U.S.-Japan Wise Men's Group reported in 1981 that there was a need for Japan to make much greater efforts to open its domestic markets to the inflow of goods, services, and capital to a degree equal to that of the United States. 11.
在1970年代末，领先的经济学家和公众人物认为，日本现在正处于一个重要的十字路口，并且公共选择的基本重新审查的时机已经到来。使所谓的美日智囊团在1981年报告中指出，日本需要做出更大的努力，以同美国一样的程度开放其国内市场，接纳商品、服务和资本的流入。11.
Sakakibara's debut.
神原英姿的首次亮相。
Thanks to the crisis, serious criticism of the bureaucracy, including the hitherto all-powerful and almost untouchable Ministry of Finance, was heard in public for the first time in the post-war era. More and more observers argued that the Japanese tradition of a strong nationalist bureaucracy was now an obstacle. Even former bureaucrats called for deregulation, administrative reforms, and a reduction of the size of the bureaucracy. 12.
由于危机，包括迄今为止一直强大且几乎不可触及的财政部在内的官僚机构首次在战后时期公开受到严厉批评。越来越多的观察家认为，日本的强大的民族主义官僚制度现在已经成为了障碍，甚至前官僚也呼吁进行放松管制、行政改革和减少官僚机构的规模。12.
Two promising young Ministry of Finance officials, members of the small career track elite, joined the increasingly outspoken and critical debate about the future of Japan's economic system. Both had taken time off from MA for a stint in academia. One was Yukio Noguchi, who has ever since remained in academia, and the other is Isuke Sakakibara, who subsequently rejoined the ministry and rose to become Vice Minister of Finance in 1997. 20 years before, in 1977, in a path-breaking article, analysis of the MOF Kingdom in the highbrow magazine Chwakoran, Noguchi and Sakakibara were the first and only public figures to clearly identify and acknowledge the true nature of Japan's economic system. They called it the wartime system for total economic mobilization.
两位有前途的年轻财政部官员，他们是小型职业发展精英的成员，加入了对日本经济体系未来的越来越直言不讳和批判的辩论。他们都曾从财政部请假到学术界工作。一个是野口幸男，他自那时起一直在学术界工作；另一个是神原英姿，他后来重新加入了财政部，并在1997年升任为财政副大臣。在20年前，也就是1977年，他们在高端杂志《中央公论》上发表了一篇开创性的文章《财政部日本银行王国的分析》。野口和神原是首批，也是唯一一批公开明确识别和承认日本经济体系真实性质的公众人物。他们称之为全面经济动员的战时体系。
Noguchi and Sakakibara correctly pointed out how the Japanese economy was far more market-oriented in the 1920s, how the control bureaucrats had introduced the post-war system during the war, and how this mobilized economy had remained fully in place in the post-war era. They also felt that this system could not continue to function with the current international environment. To them, the slump of the mid-1970s seemed evidence that the wartime system was on the point of collapse. 13. From our standpoint, the wartime system for total mobilization of economic resources is at last coming to an end. And from now on we must grapple with the real task of post-war reconstruction. 14. Not considering the possibility of a reform that might preserve some of the obvious advantages of the system. They instead called for a fundamental transformation of Japan's economic, social, and political system in the image of the United States.
野口和神原正确地指出，日本经济在1920年代更加市场导向，控制官僚在战争期间引入了战后体系，以及这种动员经济在战后时期仍然完全存在。他们也认为，这个体系无法继续在当前的国际环境中运作。对他们来说，1970年代中期的经济低迷似乎证明了战时体系即将崩溃。13. 从我们的立场来看，全面动员经济资源的战时体系终于要结束了。从现在开始，我们必须面对战后重建的真正任务。 14他们并未考虑可能保留体系明显优势的改革可能性，而是呼吁对日本的经济、社会和政治体系进行根本性的转变，以美国为模板。
The reality was that this system was far too successful to be abandoned easily. It had created many beneficiaries, such as business groups, powerful bureaucrats, and intermediary politicians, but also including the majority of the Japanese population, whose living standards had risen rapidly. In the end, the deep shock of the 1970s was not big enough to be able to say goodbye to the war economy. Noguchi therefore had to repeat his farewell to the war economy nearly 20 years later. 15.
事实是，这个系统过于成功，以至于无法轻易放弃。它创造了许多受益者，如商业集团、强大的官僚和中间政治家，包括大部分日本人口，他们的生活水平迅速提高。最后，1970年代的深度震荡并不足以让我们告别战争经济，因此，野口不得不在近20年后再次重复他的告别战争经济失误。
Credit control also manipulates public opinion.
信贷控制也操纵公众舆论。
The leaders at the Bank of Japan took note. They knew that the Bank of Japan was the only player that could create a recovery. Ministry of Finance policies to boost the economy were aimed at lowering the discount rate or fiscal stimulation. Neither could work so long as the Bank of Japan did not expand credit creation. Banks needed to be given money to write off their bad debts and clean up their balance sheets to be able to lend again. Meanwhile, the Bank of Japan, by acting as the banker to the country, could boost the economy by printing money. But as long as the BOJ failed to do this, the slump would continue.
日本银行的领导层注意到了这一点，他们知道，只有日本银行才能创造经济复苏。财政部的经济刺激政策旨在降低贴现率或财政刺激。只要日本银行不扩大信贷创造，这两者都无法起作用。银行需要得到资金来偿还他们的坏账，并清理他们的资产负债表，以便再次贷款。同时，日本银行作为国家的银行，可以通过印钞来刺激经济。但只要日本银行不这样做，经济衰退就会继续。
By the 1970s, the BOJ's smokescreen concerning credit controls had been operating for a decade, and few observers, even at MOF, were aware of the real root cause and the crucial role of window guidance. 16 Neoclassical economics was beginning to make inroads in Japan, and the economics sections of the BOJ churned out papers showing that interest rates were the key monetary policy tool. Further, the BOJ was semi-officially following monetarism. Hence, the BOJ's role remained obscured. 17 The public blamed MOF and the economic structure for the crisis.
到了1970年代，日本银行关于信贷控制的烟幕已经运作了10年，即使在财政部，也很少有观察者意识到真正的根源和窗口指导的关键作用。16新古典经济学开始在日本取得进展。日本银行的经济部门产出的论文显示，利率是关键的货币政策工具。此外，日本银行半官方地遵循货币主义，因此，日本银行的角色仍然被掩盖。17公众将危机归咎于财政部和经济结构。
Second round 1.
第二轮胜利。
Visible elites can stay in power only as long as they deliver the goods. While Japan's economy was expanding at double-digit growth rates, people did not mind the strong grip on power by the government officials and especially the Ministry of Finance. The first and biggest post-war slump immediately triggered far-reaching critique of the mobilized economic system, including the legally most powerful bureaucracy, the Ministry of Finance.
只有在他们提供商品的情况下，可见的精英才能保持权力。当日本经济以2位数的增长率扩张时，人们并不介意政府官员，特别是财政部对权力的强大控制。战后第一次也是最大的经济衰退立即引发了对动员经济系统的深入批评，包括法律上最强大的官僚机构财政部。
Whether by accident or not, the decision-makers at the Bank of Japan had won their second battle against MOF. When the BOJ finally let the economy recover in 1976, MOF was still licking its wounds. Yet the events of the 1970s were little more than a test run. It cannot be denied that the Bank of Japan had gained valuable experience in the mechanics of the creation and propagation of a real estate-based credit boom and the collapse that must follow.
无论是偶然还是有意， 日本银行的决策者们在与财政省的第二场战斗中取得了胜利。当日本银行在1976年最终让经济复苏时，财政省仍在舔舐伤口。然而，1970年代的事件不过是一次试运行。不可否认的是，日本银行在创建和传播基于房地产的信贷繁荣以及必然随之而来的崩溃的机制方面获得了宝贵的经验。